to the Young Americans for Liberty and Economics Club Economic Series, Speaker Series featuring Jim Otteson of Wake Forest University. An event like this takes a lot of organization and preparation, and I have a few thank yous before I get started. I'd like to thank my co-advisors for Young Americans for Liberty, as well as the Economics Club, Forbes Dixon, as well as Gita Shah. Lynn Kavisak in the Career and Employment Resources Division was very instrumental in organizing this event, and I'd like to thank their entire team. Tom Rankin, Elena Madison, my boss, Diana Albawari, my dean, Catherine Lassiter, as well as the senior administration for their support of the Economic Series speakers. In addition, I'd like to thank the Charles Koch Foundation for their grant, which makes this event possible. Now about our speaker. Many of you probably are not aware that the first economists were philosophers, from the French physiocrats to Adam Smith, our father of economics. They were all philosophers. Our speaker today, James Otteson, is a philosopher, and we're very honored to have him. He, in addition to being a philosopher, he's a researcher, a scholar, a professor, and he is the executive director of the Eudaimonia Institute. The Eudaimonia Institute, that strange word, eudaimonia, means flourishing. It was Aristotle's word for flourishing. So the Eudaimonia Institute is dedicated to studying the sources of flourishing. And maybe some of those sources include capitalism and business. I don't know. We're going to find out today. And please give a warm welcome to our speaker, James Otteson from Wake Forest University.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is my second time visiting Wake Tech, so thank you very much. And thank you for taking time out. I wanted to talk today about honorable business. Some of you might wonder whether there can even be such a thing as honorable business. As Professor Martin mentioned, I teach, my PhD's in philosophy, but I teach in the business school at Wake Forest University. There are not many philosophy PhDs in business schools. And when I tell people, maybe you've had this experience as well, when I tell people that I teach business ethics, oftentimes I get the response, oh, isn't that an oxymoron? How can there be such a thing as ethics in business? So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about a model that we developed at Wake Forest University. So I came to Wake Forest in 2013, and it was really as a result of some thinking that the business school had done, but not only Wake Forest Business School had done, in the wake of the 2008-2009 economic downturn. Are you all old enough to remember that? Do you remember that downturn? So there were lots of discussions about why that happened, and not just what the causes were, but also who was to blame. And there were many candidates offered for blame. That included everything from banking to finance. Some people blamed the government, some people blamed business, some people blamed capitalism or markets more generally. Some people blame business schools. So there were arguments that were made that business schools aren't teaching ethics the right way. Maybe they're teaching the wrong things, or whatever they're teaching, they're not teaching it the right way. And so for a lot of business schools, they decided that this was an opportunity for them to do some self-reflection and think about, well, are we in fact teaching things the right way? And for most business schools, that long period of soul-searching lasted probably a full 15 minutes or so, after which they decided, yep, we're doing everything exactly the right way, and they didn't make any changes at all. Wake Forest decided that it wanted to see if there wasn't something a little more they could do, and I was brought in part to Wake Forest to help them think about, could we answer a question of why business? So what might a moral purpose for business be? So not just in the business school, if business students have to learn the technical aspects of business, which they do, marketing, accounting, finance, et cetera, they need to have these technical skills, but is there some higher purpose that we could imagine that business might serve, not just enabling people to learn these skills? So that's what I want to talk about a little bit about today. And I want to ask this question, can there be such a thing as a moral purpose of business? Now, in my experience, business students who think about majoring in business, who think about studying it, maybe dedicating their lives to it, are often asked by their colleagues, their peers, their fellow students, well, why do you want to do it? And when they're asked that, this is usually the entire universe of options. It seems like there are only two reasons why you could want to study business. One is to make money, the other one's to get a job. Well, do business students want to make money and get a job? I'm sure they do. That's probably true for all students at all colleges and universities. That's probably the case still. If that's the only thing that studying business can do for you, it's not a particularly inspiring vision. It seems like maybe it could be a necessary evil, perhaps, but not necessarily something that would really motivate you morally. So I'd like to ask you to think about this comparison. Consider these two professions, medicine and business. So they are both professions. In both cases, there are specialties, there are subspecialties. In both cases, you have technical knowledge you need to learn. In both cases, it might take years of study or experience before you're good at what you're doing or before you become successful. And in both cases, if you become successful, you might make a lot of money. So in all those ways, they're similar, but think for a second how differently those two professions are viewed in the wider culture and wider society. One thing that people do not say to a medical doctor, for example, is now that you've made your money, you need to give back to society. But they say that to the business professional, don't they? You need to give back. Business needs to give back. Well, have you ever thought about that phrase? Note that people don't say business needs to give. They say it needs to give back. Think about that. If your mother, when you were a child, said to you, you need to give that back, what does that mean you did? You took something that did not belong to you. That's a bad thing. If you need to give it back, that means you stole something. Well, I would ask you to think, is that what business people do? So as a successful business person, someone who took something, did something wrong, as if we need to atone for it. Now, I'll suggest that I think many people do kind of think that about business. I mean, if you think about Hollywood movies, who's the villain in almost every Hollywood movie? It's almost always the CEO of some international company. Do people think that if you succeeded in business, there must be something you did that was bad? Maybe we don't know exactly what it is, but somewhere along the line you must have done something bad. I think a lot of people do think that. Well, so here's my suggestion. When I came to the business school at Wake Forest, I suggested this to my colleagues. If we, after thinking about all the objections people might raise to business or the objections or worries people might have about markets or capitalism or commercial society, if at the end of all of that we think, yeah, business is something that you need to make up for afterwards. If it's the kind of thing that if you're going to engage in it, you need to do something afterwards like give back to society, then my suggestion is that we shouldn't say businesses should give back. What we should say is don't engage in business. Stop doing it. I mean, think about other areas of your life. If you're thinking about doing something, this is a general piece of advice. If you're thinking about doing something and you're pretty sure that you're going to have to make up for it afterwards, that's a red flag. Usually that means you probably shouldn't do it. I mean, think about people. What do you say to a thief? You don't say to a thief, well, go ahead and keep stealing as long as you give some of it to charity. What you say is, stop stealing. What do you say to a murderer? It's okay as long as some of the people you kill are bad? No, you say, stop killing. And I think we should have the courage of our convictions. If we think that business is the sort of thing that is not valuable in itself, that you have to atone for or make up for later, then maybe we should think about not doing it. And maybe we shouldn't have schools training people in how to be better at it. You don't have schools for thievery on the hope that sometimes successful thieves will give money to charity. So my question is, shouldn't business be valuable in itself? If we're going to continue to teach business, ask students to dedicate their lives to business, then we should be able to make a case for how it's valuable in itself, in the actual activity of business, not just for what it might do afterwards, not just for charitable giving or something else it might do later, but the activity itself. And if we can't make that case, then I think maybe we should rethink teaching and engaging in business. So my claim will be there better be something that we could call honorable business. We better be able to make a case for that. If we can't, then I think we really need to rethink what we're doing. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try to explain so I'll put my cards on the table. I think there is such a thing as honorable business. If there is such a thing as honorable business, that also means there's such a thing as dishonorable business. And I think we need to know the difference and dedicate ourselves, if we're going to go into business, into only honorable and to making sure we don't engage in dishonorable business. So let me see if I can explain what this is. So Professor Markson mentioned that I'm a philosophy PhD, so you'll have to forgive me. I want to say something about Aristotle, but it'll just take a minute, so don't panic about it. Aristotle, the great ancient Greek philosopher, argued that for human beings, maybe alone among creatures on earth, we have purposes and ends, goals that we seek, and again, perhaps uniquely among creatures on earth, we can construct and change those goals. Human beings not only have things they want to achieve, but sometimes they change their minds about things. So not just the ultimate things they want to achieve, but the intermediate goals too. That often undergoes change. This is part of human nature. You don't understand human beings if you don't understand that their behavior, the choices they make, the things they do are in the service of goals. Okay, so that's meant to just be, according to Aristotle, an empirical claim, a factual claim about human beings. There's no moral conclusion that comes from that just yet. But we can think about our lives, according to Aristotle. We have proximate ends. Those are things we want to achieve today. What are you doing today? Why are you in this room today? We also have medium-term ends. What do you want to be doing in 5 years or maybe 10 years? What do you envision yourself doing? But those ends also lead to long-term and maybe final ends. So think about the end of your life. When you're 120 years old and you're looking back on your life, what kind of life do you want to have led such that you yourself will say, that was a meaningful life. That was a life worth having been led. So if you think about that from the end, here's Aristotle's idea. Think about the end point. What kind of life you would like to have led by the end of your life. And then what should you do? Reverse engineer all the way back to today. The choices you're making today are beginning, so especially Aristotle thought that when you should start thinking about this is when you are a late teen or early adult, so maybe some of you in this room. Now you are beginning to make choices where you're saying no to some things and yes to other things, and these choices are beginning to chart a path for you. Well, if you want it to be a path that will end up being some place you would like it to be, you need to start thinking now about what is the final goal so that, again, you can reverse engineer. Now, Aristotle, this is this funny word that Professor Markson mentioned. Aristotle says the ultimate goal for human beings, that's his word, eudaimonia. It's hard to translate. It's often translated, sometimes it's translated as happiness. Sometimes it's translated as flourishing. Happiness is a bit hard because in English, happiness can mean a lot of different things. It can mean contentment or maybe momentary pleasure. For Aristotle, it's a much deeper meaning. It was something like a cognizance of a life well and fully lived. So given all the skills and abilities and opportunities you have, how were you able to use all of those things in the service of ends that you think are important? If you realize that that's the kind of life you're leading, that your daily activities are leading to monthly, yearly, 5-yearly, 10-yearly activities that you think are actually important in the world, that can be a eudaimonic life. So, again, we just reverse engineer. So you come up with what that kind of life is for you, and then you order the daily activities so that you increase the chance that you'll achieve that. There's no guarantee in life, and of course, people change their minds. You're going to be doing lots of, you'll change your preferences and change all sorts of things about your life. But the idea here is that if you don't think about this now, what could happen? Have you heard of the phrase, of the sort of cliched phrase about a midlife crisis? Aristotle is one of the first people to talk about that. He says midlife crises come about when you realize at some midpoint in your life that you've just been sort of going along with whatever opportunities presented themselves to you, and then suddenly you realize at some point in your life, maybe in your 40s or something, you realize, wait, I'm not going to be on earth forever. What have I been spending all of my time doing? I've spent 20 years, let's say, doing something, but it's not clear to me where it's actually going. That's the midlife crisis. So to avoid that sort of situation, you should think now about what kind of life you will want to have led. Okay, so how does all that relate to business? So here's my suggestion. For people who are thinking about going into business, and even if you're not thinking about going into business, your life is going to be affected by business in one way or another. You're going to be either working for a company, you'll start a company, maybe start many companies, or you're working for a nonprofit that deals with companies, or you're working for the government that spends a lot of time thinking about companies. So in one way or another, your life is going to be connected to companies. So my suggestion is we need to think about this kind of hierarchy of moral purpose in the same way with respect to our business activities. So that's what I want to suggest. So what's the proper context of business? So I mentioned a hierarchy, thinking about the final ends and working our way back. So what I'd like to suggest is here's a way to think about business, starting at the highest level and working its way down to what you and I do on a daily basis, or will do on a daily basis. So here's my first step. I don't think that's too controversial. We all want a just and humane society. Now, people mean different things by those terms. If you wonder what I mean about them, I'll say I mean whatever you mean. So whatever you think a just and humane society, that's what I mean too. I'll say a little bit more concretely in a minute. My second step, there are only 5 of these steps. The second step is, whatever a just and humane society turns out to be, it's going to depend on certain public institutions. That includes political institutions, economic institutions, moral institutions, maybe cultural, if culture is an institution, cultural institutions, perhaps religious institutions. There's a variety of various kinds of institutions that will be part of a just and humane society. And I hope I'm not too controversial just yet, but this next step, there are 5, the step 3 is a little bit more controversial. I would like to suggest that among those institutions is a properly functioning market economy. Now, I want you to put on your critical hats if they aren't already on. What word in that sentence is doing a lot of work? Or if you're going to ask me, what do you mean by that? Which word would it be? Properly. What's a properly functioning market economy? Aha, yes. So I have to tell you what that means. Now, I could just sort of weasel out of it and say, oh, well, a properly functioning market economy is one that's part of the institutions that contributes to a just and humane society. Okay, that doesn't really tell you very much substantively, so let me tell you a little bit more. A properly functioning market economy includes honorable business. Okay, now what do you want to know? What's honorable business? So none of this fits together until I can get to the 5th and final stage, which is where I think it connects to us as individuals, not at the societal level, but to us as individuals. Honorable business includes industries, firms, and individuals who are creating value. And by that I mean making not only their own lives, but other people's lives better off as well. And I'll add, doing it at the same time. So that's already going to give you an idea of what honorable business is versus dishonorable business. So dishonorable business will mean something like benefiting yourself at another person's expense. That's dishonorable. Benefiting yourself while at the same time benefiting somebody else, that can be honorable business. So here's my idea. Business people, individuals, and firms that are providing value in this way are actually contributing to this hierarchy of moral purpose. And if we do it right, so is there anything wrong with wanting to benefit your own life? I don't think so. I think what makes it wrong is if you're benefiting your own life at somebody else's expense. That's wrong. Benefiting your life at what's the answer to this? If you do it right, you can create happiness for yourself in one way and in only one way. What would it be? By doing what? Serving other people. So if the way you're benefiting yourself is by creating value for other people, that's the key to a win-win. That's the key to all of us getting better together. And I would also argue that that's the only way we can all get better together. Okay, so this is just to show you that I know how to use PowerPoint. It's really the same, actually it was my administrative assistant who did that. I don't want to claim credit for it. But these are just those 5 elements. But the idea here is I would consider it a win if a graduate of, say, Wake Forest Business School or anybody who's studying business here, you go and get a job. Where's your job? Well, maybe your job is with Deloitte or your job is with Hanes Brand or wherever you get a job. Suppose you get a job with Deloitte and somebody says to you, well, what are you going to be doing at Deloitte? And your answer is, oh, I'm contributing to a just and humane society. And if somebody says, what on earth do you mean by that? You say, oh, give me 2 minutes and I'll explain it to you. And what you do is you explain how whatever you're going to be doing at Deloitte is part of honorable business, creating value not just for yourself but for others, which is part of a properly functioning market economy, which is part of the institutions that contribute to a just and humane society. Okay, now let me step back for a minute. Why should we care about this? Why does this matter, this honorable business stuff or thinking about creating value not just for oneself but for others? Here's one way to think about it. I want you to take a look at that graph. This is to show you that philosophers can make graphs too. But actually, I'm taking that from somebody else. Here's what you're looking at there. You're looking at world product. So gross world product, all of the value, all of the wealth created in the world in constant 1990 international dollars, so attempting to keep this constant from today all the way back. The blue line goes back to year 1, so just over 2,000 years ago. Red line goes back to 10,000 BC, about 12,000 years ago. That is a very remarkable graph. Now, the two economists, so the blue line is from Angus Madison, died a few years ago. He should have won the Nobel Prize for putting together this data that enabled him to calculate all of this back to year 1. Brad DeLong is an economist at Berkeley right now. He actually thinks that we can extend that line further past 10,000 BC. He thinks we can go all the way back to about 1 million years ago. Early hominins on the planet, okay, that's a bit sketchy. But from about 10,000 BC to today, that's, so economic historians tend to think we do have pretty good data there. Something remarkable happened around then. Around 10,000 BC or so, humans began to change. They made a major change in one aspect of their life. Does anybody know what happened around then? They began to do something, yeah. They settled down to do, what were they doing? Agriculture, farming, yeah. So humans began to make settled agricultural places where they stayed. Once they did that, they began to do something else, keep records. So how many goats do you own, and how many do I own, and what's my territory, and what's your territory, and those records we can look at. Those were recorded and reprinted, or not reprinted, they were re-recorded, so we can take a look at that. In any case, take a look at that graph. That is quite a remarkable hockey stick, isn't it? Now, if you're a social scientist, as I assume basically everybody in here is in one way or another, if you're a social scientist and you're looking at those at that graph, what part of that graph is the one that is interesting? Do I have a, oh, wouldn't it be this? Something happened. Something dramatic happened. So we are today living at a time where there is more wealth in the world than there has ever been in human history. At no time in human history has there been anything like the wealth that we enjoy today, the wealth that enables us to be in a nice place like this and to live stream even. Nothing like that has ever happened. But just look at that long, low line. So think about some of the great civilizations of the past that you know about. So think about the Egyptian pharaohs and their pyramids. When they were building the pyramids, not a blip. The Roman Empire, the Great Roman Empire, nothing. Song Dynasty of China, nothing. And then around 1800 or so, it went off the charts and it's continued to go up. That means something happened. Now, the reason I say this is a way to think about why our discussion today matters is because the difference between living here and living for the entire previous part of human history is the difference between life and death. It's not a marginal difference. It's not a small difference. For almost all human history, there was no change. People lived fairly short lives. They were often at the level of subsistence, and then something happened. So my question is, what happened? What changed? Are human beings biologically different today than they were 12,000 years ago? No. No, if you could transport a child from 10,000 BC to today, what would that child be doing? Playing Fortnite like everybody else. Be no difference. You wouldn't notice any difference. Are we psychologically different? No. Has climate change made a difference? Climate has gone up and down throughout that period, and as it goes up and down, no change in overall prosperity. So something else happened, and that's a very important question, is to figure out what else happened. So Deirdre McCloskey, the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey, calls that the Great Enrichment. So there has been this Great Enrichment. How great has it been? Here are just a couple of facts maybe you remember from Thomas Hobbes. How many of you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan? Let the record show that's everybody. Okay. Famous quote from Hobbes is, "The life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, short." Before about 1800 or so, he was right. That was true for just about everybody. Average person alive in 1800 was no better off in material terms than the average person from 100,000 years earlier. No change in human existence. People lived on 1 to 3 contemporary dollars per day. I want you just to think about that for a second. Could you live on, let's be generous, $3 a day? Only $3. That's for all your food, clothing, shelter, coffee, the latest iPhone. Samsung's just released its new, or announced its new folding phone, which costs, I think, $2,000. How many of you are going to get one of those immediately? Okay. $1 to $3 a day. So could you survive on $3 a day? Maybe. Wouldn't be easy. Are there some people living in the world today who are still living at that level? There are. There are. So what is it today? In the world, again in constant dollars, $48 per person per day, as opposed to 1 to 3. In the United States, $164 per person per day. So what does that mean? That means a 16-fold real increase worldwide and a 55-fold real increase in the United States. That is a huge increase. It's hard for us to appreciate that. I give you all of that because it's hard for us to appreciate if it's just all we know or it's the only thing we can think of, it's the only experience we have. But the difference between living at $164 a day and living at $3 a day is huge and tremendous. And I mentioned that it doesn't include what economists sometimes call hidden wealth. I'll just give you one quick example of hidden wealth. So there's an economist named Michael Cox at SMU, Southern Methodist University, who a couple of years ago started asking his students this question. I'll ask you, how much money would I have to give you for you to be willing to never go on the internet again the rest of your life? What would it be? No access to the internet. How much money would it take? Somebody give me a number. What would it take? Billions with an S? Billions? Okay, any other number? Can I get it cheaper? Who would do it for $1 million? Oh, we got a couple. 100 million? Couple? Who would do it for 10,000? Nobody. Okay. I mean, there might be a generational thing going on. Okay, so when Cox asked this question of his students, he got similar answers: 100 million, $1 billion, billions with an S. Okay, so very large numbers, whatever those numbers are. So whatever your number is, the interesting part is the next question. So I'll tell you what the next question is. What are you yourself personally paying to get on the internet right now? So for most students, what's the answer to that question? What are they themselves paying to get on the internet? Nothing. Zero. Internet access is provided for them by their parents, by their schools, by Starbucks, by other people. They're paying nothing. So something they themselves value at the level of 100 million, a billion, billions of dollars, they get for nothing. Now that doesn't figure in exactly to our estimate of just how wealthy in real terms we are. But that's just one example of the kind of resources that you and I have at our disposal that we might take for granted that previous generations. Do any of you remember a time before cell phones? Any students remember that? Okay. You know, there used to be a time when there was no Google, when in order to look something up, you had to physically go to a thing called a library and take out something called a book. Yeah. Okay, so let me go back to my question. So what caused this change? There has been a tremendous change. It has increased the wealth and prosperity of billions of people on Earth to a very large degree. What caused the change? Now, maybe some of you have a theory about that or have some theories about that. But let me give you I'm going to give you my own theory, but let me preface it by asking a question. So I don't know if anybody, oh, that's a very nice, is that an iPhone you have there? So we have what model is that? Suppose I say that's a very nice iPhone you have. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. I'm kidding. Suppose I would like to get her iPhone. I would like to have her. I don't have an iPhone. I would like to have her iPhone. There are really two ways I could get that from her, aren't there? What's one way I could get that iPhone from her? Oh, I like how the first thing you think of, steal it. Okay, so I could steal it from her. I could kill her and take it and... I mean, as long as we're being dark about it, I guess. What else could I do? I could also defraud her, couldn't I? Couldn't I say, I'll give you $1,500 for it, let's say, and you suppose you say, yes, that sounds good, and I say, I'll give it to you in 2 weeks. And you say, okay, and for some reason you trust me, and you give me the phone, and then I take off. So that's sort of one group of ways that you could get it, by stealing or taking it. What's characteristic of those ways is it involves unwillingness on the other person's part. So if you're stealing it, the other person is not giving you voluntary permission. They're not agreeing to it. That's what that means. So you're just taking it. We might call that extraction. So that's one way to get what you want, is by extracting it from another person, which means not seeking or getting voluntary cooperation. You just take it from them. But there's something else that you need to know about those, or need to think about those kinds. I mean, does that count as an exchange? I guess, sort of. But economists like to call that a zero-sum exchange. Zero-sum exchange. Maybe some of you will know that term. Why is it zero-sum? Well, if I take her iPhone, it's plus one iPhone for me, minus one iPhone for her. Plus one plus minus one equals zero. It's a zero sum. It's not creating new or more wealth. All it's doing is transferring resources from one place to another. Here's my suggestion. That long, low red line that I showed you on that graph before, that's what was going on throughout almost all of human history. Most of human history has been marked by extraction. As soon as one person or one group gets enough power over another, they conquer them, kill them, take their stuff. That doesn't increase wealth. It just moves it from one place to another. How did the pharaohs build their pyramids? How did the pharaohs build their pyramids? Yeah, that's extraction. That's not paying somebody a voluntary wage. That's forcing them to work against their will, usually on pain of death. How did the Romans build their Colosseum and their aqueducts, which were beautiful and still to some extent exist today? Same way. How did they get their riches? Conquer other people's lands, take their stuff. That's all extraction. So that's one way you can get what you want. What's the other way? What would be the other way I could get the cell phone? Yeah, I could make an offer which she's free to accept or decline. And if she accepts it, so suppose I say, I'm going to give you, I don't know, whatever it be, $1,000 for your phone. And let's suppose, yeah, okay. Suppose she says yes, and I actually give you the $1,000, and you give me the phone. What would we call that? Well, that's a mutually voluntary transaction. Now, is that a zero-sum transaction? Let's think about that. Who benefits from that transaction? Yeah, so I mean, and that applies to lots of other cases too. You go into Starbucks and order your double pumpkin spice mocha latte, and the barista says that'll be $5. You give $5, you get the latte. Which of you benefits from that transaction? Starbucks or you? Both. You both benefited. How do we know? We know that that has to be the case. If you didn't think you benefited from getting that latte, you would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. If Starbucks didn't think it benefited from giving you the latte in exchange for the $5, it would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. So if you both voluntarily did it, that means you both must think, according to your own schedule of value, that you benefited. Same thing with the iPhone. If we have a voluntary exchange, we both benefit. So that's not zero sum. What might we call that? Not zero. Positive. Positive sum. Because if we engage in that voluntary transaction, I benefited, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. That's positive value for me. She benefits, otherwise she wouldn't have done it. Positive value for her. Positive plus a positive is a positive. Okay? So, what explains or begins to help account for that huge hockey stick, the neck, as it were, of the hockey stick? These are the two ways to exchange. Extraction, and I'll call the other one cooperation. Extraction is involuntary, zero sum. Cooperation is mutually voluntary and then mutually beneficial, or positive sum. What do we need in order to do that? Well, we need to have people's property respected so that I can't just come and take it. If it's her property, and if I know that if I just took it I would be punished for that, then the only way I can get it is by making some offer that matters to her. Now here's a key of that. Think about, are you seeing a connection to honorable business yet? If there are things in the world that I would like, whether it's anything from people's love, to their labor, to their laptops or their iPhones, if the only way I can get those things is by quitting the Apple software update, is by getting the voluntary agreement of another person, who do I have to think about? Who do I have to spend time thinking about? The other person, Right, so maybe some of you are CEOs or know CEOs or will be CEOs. What keeps CEOs up at night? Whether that's a sole proprietor or somebody with a bigger company. What keeps them up? Are they thinking about themselves? If they're thinking only about themselves and what they want, they're going to go out of business. What do they have to be thinking about? Everybody else. Employees, customers, clients, suppliers. Constantly thinking about other people. And the reason for that is because other people can say no thank you and go somewhere else. And if you can't force them, then the only way you can get what you want is through voluntary cooperation, which means you have to offer them something that matters to them. So what do we need in order to do that? We need the institutions of justice, which means you protect people's persons, you protect people's property, and voluntary contracts. You make a promise, you have to keep it. You also have to have the freedom to decide for yourself what kind of thing you want to do. There are lots of things. You are all very intelligent and skilled people and are getting even more intelligent and more skilled the more time you spend here at this institution. There are going to be lots of things you could do. Which of them should you do? Should you be an accountant? Many of you, I don't know if any of you are going to go into or want to go into accounting, but many of you could go into accounting. You have the skills to do it, or you will soon have the skills. Some of you might go into finance. You could do well at that. Maybe you go into law. You could do well at that. At any of those things, you might be successful. How do you know which one to pick? Well, the first part of it is you need to have the freedom to exploit your own local knowledge. What I mean by that is you have to know what matters to you. What are the opportunities you have, the constraints you face, and you need to be able to make decisions within those. And then you also have to get the feedback from your decisions. If you make a bad decision that leads to bad consequences, you need to feel that, because that's how you learn good judgment. If you don't feel the consequences of bad decisions, you don't learn to know not to do that again. You need to get the consequences of the good decisions to know that that's what you should continue to do. So here's my suggestion. Cooperative business. By the way, which of those two ways is a more moral way to deal with other people? Extraction or cooperation? I hope it's obvious. It's obvious to me, but just to keep with our historical imagination, it hasn't been obvious throughout all of human history. In fact, that's a fairly recent change in human views. Okay, so I argue that cooperative business conducted in such an environment of cooperation, freedom, and responsibility is honorable business. That's what it is. Now I give you some historical information. Is there any contemporary information we might talk about? I'll just give you a little bit of contemporary data about this, connecting markets and what I'm calling honorable business and well-being. First of all, does anybody know what the most market-oriented economy in the world today is? Not the professors. So a team of economists has been ranking the countries in the world. They started doing this. It's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. It's published by the Fraser Institute in Canada. It comes out every year. It's updated every single year. It's an international team of economists who've been doing this since 1975. One economy has been number one on their Economic Freedom Index ever since. So from 1975 all the way through and including in the most recent report, that's Hong Kong. So they're the top 10. I'm just telling you the 10 freest economies in the world. There they are. As you look down that list, there's at least one country that's rather noticeable by its absence. What country is missing from that list? The United States. The United States is not in the top 10. The United States has been as high as number 2. We've been as low as 18. We're currently 11, so we're just outside of the top 10. They just scored on a scale of 0 to 10, and just for comparison's sake, I'll give you the bottom. So you see the top 10, Hong Kong is about 9 out of 10. There's the bottom 10. Now they currently rate about 145 countries. They don't rate all countries because they can't for a couple reasons. One, because countries sometimes merge and change. And also they don't rate countries that they can't get independent data on. So 2 countries that do not get ranked on this scale are North Korea and Cuba. So North Korea and Cuba put out economic data, but they just make it up. So North Korea claims 7% annual economic growth. Well, they don't have that. So they just make it up. So if they can't independently verify the data, same thing with Cuba. Cuba puts out a lot of economic reports, but they just make stuff up. If they can't independently verify it, they don't rate it. But there you see the bottom 10. Do you notice the country that's on the bottom? There's a human tragedy unfolding before our eyes right now in Venezuela. maybe it's connected. Okay, so those are the top 10 and bottom 10. Now, maybe that's not so interesting. Here's what or maybe that is interesting, but I think what's more sort of morally relevant is, can we compare? So we just rank all the countries from the most economically free to the least economically free. Can we compare that to various ways we might measure human flourishing? What are the things that actually matter to people? How do citizens of these various countries do on various ways of measuring human well-being? That's a little more interesting. So one way to look at, and this is maybe the main economist's way, they like to look at things you can count and measure. Money is something you can count. GDP is something you can count. So how does it stack up? So what I've done here is I just broke all of the countries, about 145 countries, into quartiles. Most free, then the second quartile, third and fourth quartile. And if you look at constant purchasing power parity, so 2006 United States dollars, there you can see a pretty dramatic increase. So the freer your country is, the wealthier the country is. And it's pretty dramatic. In fact, it's about an order of magnitude difference. That's overall for the country. What about the poorest in the country? So suppose you are unlucky enough to be among the poorest 10% of your country. So if we took those 145 countries and just looked at the poorest 10% of those countries, how does that score here? Well, that's what this looks like. Most free quartile over here, second, third, and fourth. There you see again a rather dramatic difference. And again, it's about an order of magnitude. So the poorest 10% are about 10 times wealthier than in their countries than the poorest 10% of the least free countries. Again, that's a pretty dramatic difference. Okay, so that's money. Is money all that matters? Boy, some of you are not so sure about that. Okay, well, my answer is no. I don't think money is the only thing that matters. But here's what I would argue. What money can do is enable other things that do matter. So if I'm worrying about whether I can eat today, whether I have enough money to eat today, or whether I have enough money for my children to eat today, what am I not thinking about? I'm not thinking about where my kid's going to go to college. I'm not thinking about, can I write the great American novel? I'm not thinking about developing the next great killer app. What I'm thinking about is, can we eat today? What wealth can do, increasing wealth can do, is enable us to address those more basic, pressing concerns, food, clothing, shelter, that can then enable us to begin turning our attention to other things that really go into filling out a life of meaning and purpose. So it's not that wealth is equated to a life of meaning and purpose, but I would suggest that it can help enable it. So if I'm right about that, then that should mean that increasing wealth connects with other things, not just wealth itself, but increasing wealth connects with other things that might matter to us. And it turns out that it does. So the more market-based your economy is, the more likely your citizens are going to score higher on all of these criteria. And just take a look at those criteria. So wealth, we already saw, but life expectancy, infant survival, child nutrition, literacy rates. Look over here, political stability, peace, life satisfaction. Life satisfaction is self-reported life satisfaction. So we do a lot of surveying of people around the world. We ask them questions like, all things considered, are you happy with the direction that your life is going? Give people a 0 to 10 scale, and we track their answers and the answers of the other citizens in their countries. We look at it in different demographic groups. We separate it according to all sorts of different groups. But there are clear trends that what wealth can do, or the score citizens give on self-reported scores they give on that tracks with how free their economies are. Okay. Even environmental protection, which might be a little bit surprising. It includes sustainability. All right, so we're all social scientists in this room. Let me ask you a question. Have you heard the phrase, correlation is not causation? Correlation is not causation. So if you see correlations, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're seeing a causal relationship. If A and B track one another, it doesn't mean that A causes B or that B causes A. There might be other things going on. What are these? Are these causal relationships or are these correlations? Well, they're correlations. They're correlations. And it's very hard, in fact, when you're dealing with human subjects, it's hard to get causal relationships because that usually requires putting humans into controlled experiments, and often humans don't like being put in controlled experiments. So it's very hard to do that, so you have to take this with a grain of salt. And if we had only one or two or three of these that correlated, might not make much of a case. But when you have this many kinds of correlations that all point in the same direction, that begins to make it look like you're actually onto something. And I'll say virtually every way. I mean, to run these kinds of studies, and my institute that Professor Markson mentioned, we're involved in this, so we are also trying to conduct these studies in various ways. In order to run an empirical study, you have to measure something that you can look at, see, count. You can't count happiness, so you have to try to figure out what might be proxies for it and what might, maybe happiness is a latent variable, if you know what that is, when we try to get at it in various indirect ways. But almost every way we've been able to come up with that looks like it might have something to do with pointing towards a proxy of genuine human flourishing tracks positively and with statistical significance in the same way. I mean, we even count things like how many toothbrushes per household, how many magazine subscriptions per. I mean, does that, if you have more magazine subscriptions, does that mean you're leading a more flourishing life? I don't know, maybe. But those are the kinds of things we can count. So my suggestion is that this begins to look like a pretty compelling case, and maybe not a decisive, we may never get a decisive case, but a compelling case because so many of these things seem to point in the same direction. Okay. Now let me change gears a little bit. The last couple of minutes for our presentation, I would like to raise a couple of potential objections. So I've talked about my conception of honorable business. I showed you that hockey stick graph. My suggestion was that it was a changing mindset of people beginning to think that extraction was morally wrong and that cooperation was morally preferable to extraction, and that as more and more people dealt with one another on terms of mutually voluntary cooperation, that's what began that upward tick. It's a relatively recent change in human life. So that's been my suggestion so far. But that all sounds like the good stuff. Are there some bad stuff? Are there some bad things to worry about? Well, here's one worry. Do market economies, even market economies in which only honorable business is engaged in, could they have an element of unfairness to them? So here's one potential objection. So there's a school of political thought called luck egalitarianism. It's a mouthful. I apologize about that. Luck egalitarianism. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It's a very simple idea, a straightforward idea. The idea is that luck plays a big role in our lives. That's true, isn't it? Some people have good luck, some people have bad luck. Maybe you were lucky enough to be born to parents who loved you. You were born in a place that was not war-torn or violent. You were sent by other people to good schools. Your parents sent you to, or somebody else sent you to good schools. Somebody else paid for you to get a college education. Some people have a lot of good luck in life. Other people don't have such good luck in life. What the luck egalitarian argues is that everybody has some luck, but some have systematically better luck than others. But if it's luck, then by definition, you didn't deserve it. You didn't do anything to earn it. You didn't earn wherever your parents decided to send you to school, if they decided to send you to school. That's sheer luck from your perspective. So if you didn't earn it yourself, that means you don't deserve it, but that means you don't deserve it in either direction. If you had good luck or bad luck, it's not your fault. So the luck egalitarian says, in a commercial society, sometimes people with good luck get rewarded for their good luck. People with bad luck get punished for it. That seems unfair. So maybe what we should do is redistribute some of the success, some of the fruits of the success of the people who've had a lot of good luck to people who've had a lot of bad luck to help equalize the effects of luck in people's lives. That's why it's called luck egalitarianism, equalizing the luck in people's lives. Okay? Fair enough. So that's a potential objection. So what I'd like to do is give you what I think might be a potential response to that. I'm going to do my best to try to provoke everyone, maybe offend some people as much as I can. Here's my proposition, my proposal for your consideration. If you have undeserved bad luck, so you had bad luck, we agree it's undeserved, you didn't deserve it, and you were disappointed as a result, so something bad happened to you and you're disappointed, and we think it's reasonable that you were disappointed. We would be disappointed if we were in your position too. If you have both of those, undeserved bad luck and reasonable disappointment, what I'd like to suggest is that by itself doesn't necessarily mean anybody owes you anything. That's a hard pill to swallow, so I want you to think about that for a second. So there are some luck egalitarians who will argue that if you had either one of those, either undeserved bad luck or reasonable disappointment, then you're owed compensation. I want to take the harder case. Even if you have both, it doesn't necessarily mean you'd have to make a further argument to say that somebody owes you something. That's my proposition. Let me give you a reason to think about it. Let me introduce you to two students at Wake Forest named Jack and Jill. I've changed their names to protect the innocent. Jack and Jill were senior economic majors at Wake Forest University. They'd been dating for some time. It was March of their senior year, and so they were beginning to think, should we start coordinating our after-graduation plans? Maybe we should start applying for jobs in the same city. They were starting to have these thoughts. One Sunday evening, Jack calls Jill and says to Jill, I'd like to take you out to dinner next Saturday night. And she says, great. And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, it's going to be special? And he says, it's going to be special. So Jill hangs up the phone, and she starts to wonder, what does he mean by that? So she asks her roommates, hey, Jack wants to take me out to dinner, says it's going to be special. You don't think he's going to ask me to marry him, do you? And they say, yes, he is totally going to ask you to marry him. So they all start thinking about what's going to happen if Jack asks her to marry him. She starts imagining it. What would her life be like? How would this change her various choices and opportunities and values and all of these things? She decides, if Jack asks me, I'm going to say yes. Okay, so that's her decision. Now, Jack, for his part, after he hangs up the phone, he calls up the restaurant. He says, I'd like to make a reservation for dinner. For 2, I'm going to ask my girlfriend to marry me. And they say, oh, that's so wonderful. We'll have violins and flowers and things. He says, great. Okay. That's Sunday night. Monday, Jill is in class. She's not really paying attention too much to class because she's thinking about what might be happening on Saturday. Jack is at the same time, he's at a jewelry store. He takes his student loan money, and no, I'm kidding. You do not take your student loan money. That would be bad. He buys an engagement ring. So about the time on Monday morning that Jack is buying his engagement ring, class has ended, she's on her way out of class, and she gets stopped by Joe. Now, who is Joe? Well, Joe's another kid who's been in the class the whole semester. She knows sort of him, but they've never really talked. Joe stops her and says, hey, Jill, I didn't catch what the professor said at the end of class. Did you catch it? And she said, oh, yeah, let me look at my notes. And she looks at her notes, and she looks at Joe, and their eyes meet, and there's a bit of a spark. And so they chat for a few minutes, and Joe says to her, hey, you want to go get a cup of coffee or something? And she says, oh, yeah, I was supposed to go to a midterm review session, but I don't have to go to that. Sure, let's go get a cup of coffee. So they go get a cup of coffee. They chat for a while. They end up chatting for hours. They miss all the rest of their classes. They spend the entire rest of the afternoon talking. Now all of a sudden it's evening time. Time has flown by. Again, Joe says to her, holy cow, I can't believe how much time we spent. Would you like to get a bite to eat? And she says, oh gosh, yeah. I was supposed to go visit my grandmother in intensive care, but I'm sure she's fine. Yeah, let's go get a bite to eat. So they go and get some pizza. They talk some more. I won't tell you the rest of the story. Maybe you can imagine it. They end up they walk around the quad. They go to the library. They keep walking around and talking. They do this all night long. So it is now the next morning. It is now Tuesday morning. The sun is coming up over campus. Joe looks at the sun. He looks at Jill. He says, Jill, I've never met anybody like you before. I can't believe what I'm feeling right now, and I can't believe what I'm about to say, but marry me right now. Let's go to the courthouse, and let's just get married right now. All of a sudden, Jill sort of snaps out of whatever fantasy she had been in and realizes, oh my gosh, I've just spent all this time with somebody who is a virtual stranger. She looks at her phone for the first time, and she has 78 texts and Snapchats and where are your friends, and also Jack. Do you remember Jack? Where are you? What happened? Are you dead? Why aren't you responding? You know how people are when they don't respond immediately to text. They think something bad has happened. She looks at her phone, and she's starting to have all the thoughts that you can imagine she might have. And while she's having these thoughts, she looks at Joe and she says, yes, let's go get married. And they do. Right then, Tuesday afternoon, they go and get married. Okay, so there's my little story for you to think about. Now let me ask you, did Jack have some pretty bad luck? Is that bad luck the week you were going to ask your long-term girlfriend to marry you, she happens to be approached by some virtual stranger and decides to elope right then? Seems like that's bad luck. If Jack is, dodged a bullet. If Jack is disappointed by that, would we agree that that seems like reasonable disappointment? That would seem like a bummer, wouldn't it? So here's my question. What is Jack owed? Is Jack owed something? So he had undeserved bad luck. He had reasonable disappointment. Does that mean that he can make some kind of claim on Jill? Should he be able to sue her for the future 9 children he expected her to bear him that now he won't? Or to all of the affection he wanted to get from her that now he won't be able to get? Is he disappointed about those things? Sure. But does he have a right to those things? No. And the reason he doesn't have a right to those things, and it's very important to state this, the reason he doesn't have a right to those things is because he has no right to Jill. She is a free person. She gets to make decisions for herself, even if that means that other people get disappointed, and even if it's as a result and part of lucky chance occurrences. So if you're a friend of Jack's, maybe you owe him something out of your friendship, so maybe you take him out for a beer and you say, dude, that's a bummer, and you have a couple of beers. Sure, that's maybe you introduce him to somebody else. This is, here's Jenny, here's Jerry, 21st century, any of those things is fine. But what you can't do is go impose costs on Jill. So is it an injustice that requires punishment? No. And here's my suggestion relating to business. Same thing with business. You're the owner of a coffee shop A. I go to your coffee shop every day, and then a coffee shop opens up across the street. I try that one, and I like it better. Maybe most of your customers, maybe all of your customers like coffee shop B better. Is that bad luck for you as the owner of coffee shop A? Yes. Are you reasonably disappointed that your business doesn't continue to flourish? Yes. Do you have any claim to make? No. Does anybody owe you compensation? No. And the reason for that is that the owner of a coffee shop has no more right to patrons than Jack has a right to Jill. Okay, last one. While you're thinking about Jack and Jill and dodging a bullet. So if in a market economy, commercial society, even one in which only honorable business is being engaged in, will there be inequality? Yes. Will some people have more wealth than others? Yes. Will some people have greater incomes? Yes. So here's my question. Should justice address that material inequality? Is that a subject of, is material inequality, which there will be, is that a subject of justice? So while you're thinking about that, I'll just give you an example. Suppose we have 2 people, A and B, and A is much wealthier than B. So let's say A has 10 times, we'll make it even higher. Let's say A has 100 times as much wealth as B. 100 times as much wealth as B. Now, without knowing anything else about who A and B are, do you think that a society in which one person could have 100 times as much wealth as another person must necessarily be an unjust society? So maybe I see some of you nodding and some of you shaking your heads, okay? If you do, maybe you think there's a failure of justice, or if you like, maybe you want to use the term social justice, but different people mean different things by that term, but that might be one aspect of a social justice concern. Well, let me tell you who my A and B are. Here's my A. You recognize him? Who's that? That's Bill Gates, saying, thank God so many people like Microsoft. What's Bill Gates' wealth? What's he worth? Does anybody know? It's about $90 billion, $90 billion. It goes up and down with market returns, but what's a billion among friends? It's about $90 billion. So who is the person who has to, who is only 1/100th as wealthy as Bill Gates, who has to suffer through life only, are you doing the math? Who's that person? Now, I could pick many people, but I'll pick one who's a neighbor of ours. Recognize him? Who's that? Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan's worth only about $900 million. So he has to suffer. Now, those are extreme examples, obviously. So Michael Jordan only has about 1/100th the wealth of Bill Gates. And by the way, Bill Gates used to, he doesn't do this anymore, but he used to at one point, he used to say, I could buy Michael Jordan 100 times over. He liked to say that publicly. That was sort of his, geeks beat jocks sort of thing. Okay, he doesn't say that anymore, but it's still true. He's still 100 times as wealthy. Now, this is an extreme example, but what is that supposed to show? Well, here's what I think it shows. What actually matters is, how did the wealthier person get their wealth? Did they get it through extraction, through force, fraud, theft? And then with B, I think you have to pay attention to the absolute quality of the life of the person who's worth only 1/100th as much. So Michael Jordan is extremely poor relative to Bill Gates, not relative to the rest of, well, I won't speak for the rest of you, for many of the people in the room, for many of the people in the world, he's extremely wealthy. So the idea that we should transfer some wealth from Bill Gates to make Michael Jordan better off seems absurd. So I think we have to pay attention to the absolute quality of life. Now, maybe you think that's not enough of an, that kind of example is too far out on the tail end of the bell curve. So let's think about this. Maybe let's think about larger disparities. Instead of 100 times, how about 1,000 times? How about 10,000 times? 100,000 times. Let's make it 180,000 times. So let's take a person, imagine a person who was worth only 180,000th of Bill Gates' wealth. Who is that poor schmuck who has to try to survive in life? That's me. Actually, I'm rounding up a little bit just to make it a little less ridiculous. Okay. So again, what's that supposed to mean? What I think that means is we still have to pay attention to how did the wealthier get it. So the mere fact of a difference isn't enough. You have to figure out how did the wealthier person or parties get it. And then also look at the absolute quality. But one way to think about this is, what's your answer to that question? Suppose you could change one thing in the world, but only one thing. You could get rid of poverty, or you could get rid of inequality. Which would you get rid of? If you could only do one, and not both. Well, I mean, you can think about your own answer to that. My answer is poverty. So I would say poverty is a much greater cause of human misery than inequality is. And only once we've gotten rid of poverty in the world, then maybe we can start turning our attention to other things, like maybe some of the difficulties involved with inequality. But the reason I want you to think about that question is because it seems like, from historical, empirical evidence, that might actually be the situation we face. Remember that long, low red line? So what it looks like we've been able to figure out is how to increase prosperity, so raise people out of poverty. But when they begin to come out of poverty, they come out at different rates. So some people get wealthier at a faster rate or at higher levels than others. On the other hand, we also know how to keep people relatively equal. How do we keep them relatively equal? They're relatively equally poor. So that seems to be the choice we actually face. Okay, last little thought, and then I'm going to conclude. You mentioned Adam Smith, so I felt like I should say something about Adam Smith. Second most famous passage from Adam Smith. The most famous passage is the one that has the phrase invisible hand in it. This is the second most famous. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. Now Wealth of Nations is a long book. It came out in 1776, an auspicious year. It's 1,000 pages long. This comes barely 20 pages in. It's right near the beginning. Now, when you read that passage, is this what you hear Smith saying? Do you hear Smith saying human beings are naturally selfish? Or maybe is he saying he's encouraging it? You should be selfish. Don't think about other people. That's what at least some commentators have thought. One very prominent commentator in the 19th century who thought that was Karl Marx. So Karl Marx read The Wealth of Nations. He read this, and he said, there it is. The smoking gun of capitalism. It's 20 pages into that book, and he says, it's all about me. All right, there it is. You don't hardly have to even keep reading in the book. Well, maybe when you do your studies of Adam Smith, maybe that's a conclusion you'll come to. I'd like to suggest an alternative interpretation. What I think Smith thought he was getting at was not that he was advocating selfishness, but that he was advocating something very different. Respect. That's very different. When the other person you're dealing with has the right and opportunity, but the right to say no thank you to any proposal, offer, association, partnership, anything, any offer you would make, if the other person has a right to say no thank you, then any offer you make has to be one that takes that person's interest into consideration too. If anybody can say no, who's the richest person on earth today? It's not Bill Gates. It was at one time Bill Gates. Who is it today? Amazon man. Yeah, Jeff Bezos. So over 100 billion or something. He comes in here, maybe he could offer you a job for $1 billion. Maybe he could do that. But if you have the right to say no thank you and go somewhere else if you want to, then your agency is immediately leveled. You are now immediately moral peers. If nobody can compel you, mandate you, force you to do something you don't voluntarily choose, then they have no more power over you than you have over them. That's a kind of equality of moral agency that's demonstrated by that opt-out option. If everybody has the opt-out option, then we might not end up with the same amount of wealth, but we have an equality of authority. We have an equality of moral agency. Nobody has any more authority over you than you. That's a picture drawn by famous philosopher of science, Fleming Jenkins. Maybe some of you have heard of him. That's supposed to be the market. That was his drawing of what the market is. Notice how they're all sort of connected and nobody's more important than anybody else. Okay, so let me conclude my argument. Here's what I would like for you to consider taking away from the discussion. Honorable business within markets, and by that I mean not extractive, not crony. We didn't really talk about cronyism, but I will just mention that I think cronyism is a version of extraction. Honorable business within market institutions generates increasing wealth, and it leads to lots of other benefits too, ancillary benefits that come about because people have more wealth. But it also, and from my perspective, even more importantly, demonstrates the right way to deal with other people. The morally proper way to deal with other people is by treating them as your moral peers. That means you make them offers, if you would like, for association, exchange, partnership, etc., and you respect their right to say no thank you and go somewhere else if they choose. You respect their choices. That's, I think, the right way to deal with people, not just in markets, actually in all aspects of human life. But in honorable business, it's a necessary constraint. You don't engage in business in which you are not respecting other people's right to say no thank you and go somewhere else. What we could get then, I think, I'd like to suggest, from honorable business is both prosperity and morality. And if that's the case, then honorable business, so understood, might actually be a moral calling. And with that, we'll say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you.
Looks like we have time for a few questions. Just raise your hand if you have questions.
So
Yes, ma'am.
I had a question about the top 10 countries
Oh, yes.
in markets. Are any, I don't remember which ones they are. I remember Hong Kong was at the top. And
Hong Kong,
Australia
Singapore.
was like 10.
Yes.
So are any of them socialists?
Well, define socialism for me now.
Well, like, for example, Denmark, Sweden, like
yeah.
the countries that have, the reason why is because of the free market.
Right.
I mean, is the free market impacting their numbers? And
Yes. So the way that their rankings are constructed, the kind of criteria they look for are things like the ability for people to have their private property respected. Can you move money in and out? Is there sound banking, sound currency? And also not directly welfare benefits, but what they look at is the proportion of things like GDP that are consumed by various government agencies. So on those criteria, some of those, when people talk about the Scandinavian countries, those are often, some people talk about those as being sort of, maybe the exemplar of socialism, because you have a kind of combination, or maybe a third way, because you have a combination of markets on the one hand, but you have very expansive, they're slightly different in the different countries, but you have relatively expansive welfare states, relatively generous. So that gives them mixed ranking on the economic freedom. But I would say that they're, to the pieces of your question, one is I wouldn't think of them as socialist countries. They don't call themselves socialist countries. They're market-based commercial societies, but they have generous welfare benefits. The one country that's an interesting potential exception to that normal rule is Sweden, because Sweden has actually, over the last about 10 years, significantly rolled back its welfare benefits. It's made them much less generous, the welfare benefits. It has also sold off a lot of state-run firms and industries, so it's becoming a much more market-oriented country. The United States trajectory at the moment is heading downward, not upward, so it may well be that Sweden and the United States pass each other. Can I look real fast?
just because the question about free markets.
Yeah. I don't know if I can call it up. Oh, yes, I can. Let me get it. Come on.
questions?
We have an online question.
Oh.
It asks, if we as a society strive for a utopia where everyone wins, wouldn't we create a trusting sense that could be taken advantage of and suppress skepticism?
Oh my goodness. That's a good philosophical question. That must be a philosopher.
Repeated again.
So the question is, if we could somehow create a utopian society in which everybody trusted each other, would that be exactly the kind of society in which somebody who is of a mind to could take advantage of everybody else? Something like that, does that seem right? I'll take the answers, yes, okay. So that's a hard question. So two pieces to that, and I'll say this quickly. One is trust is an enormously important feature of a prosperous economy. So if you look at, so another ranking that I didn't give you here, but another thing that economists rank, including my institute, we look at levels of background trust that people have for their fellow citizens in countries, and we rank countries on that scale too. Which countries are near the top of that? Scandinavian countries. They have a very great deal of background trust. So if you're in Bergen, Norway, and you have you set your purse down outside of a store with an iPad on it and cash sitting on top of it, and then you go into the store and shop for 2 hours, when you come back, that will all still be there. Yeah, so there are countries in which that's the case, and then there are other countries where you would never dream of doing that, because not only would they take it if you turned your back, but they might take it off your shoulder. So what's interesting about that is that prosperity tracks very closely with that. So countries in which there's more trust, those are countries in which there's more prosperity, and it makes perfect sense. If I can't trust that you're going to keep your word, if I'm not sure whether you're the sort of person who's going to do what you say you do, I'm much less inclined to actually engage in a partnership with you or an exchange with you. But if I think you're the sort of person who will keep your word no matter what, or stealing is something you would never do no matter what, just through force of your own character, not because somebody's watching you, that inclines me much more to be willing to engage in you, and that enables much more mutually beneficial transaction. So trust is very important, but the other part of it is, if you have a trusting society, is that the kind of society in which a con man or somebody like that could flourish? Yes. Yes, it is. So think about, it's kind of a liar's paradox. If you're somebody who likes to lie or wants to lie to get what you want, what kind of a society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society in which everybody lies? No, that's not going to get you anywhere, because then if you made a promise, nobody would believe you. What's the society you want to live in? The one where everybody expects that you're going to tell the truth. Yeah, that's a really hard question to get over, and I think if you can figure that, or your questioner can figure out how we go from a low-trust society to a high-trust society, how we move up those rankings, you'll win the Nobel Prize. And I'm not kidding. People are very much trying to figure that out, and we really don't quite know. Good question, hard question. Yeah.
All right, well, we have, I think we're just about out of time, and our Career and Employment Resources Division actually has a raffle. But before, yeah. All right, we're at